I attended the Norcrest School District in Maryland during my middle and high school years. It was a relatively affluent area, and students were often offered numerous excursion opportunities. As a member of the vocal ensemble, we usually took at least 1 or 2 optional trips annually as a class. The specific year I'm recalling, during my sophomore year, we traveled to the Hemlock Grove Lodge in Virginia. The drive there by coach took approximately 3 hours. My friend Alex and I were assigned to share a room. From the moment we arrived, we sensed it would be quite quiet. After all, it was late October, so the weather was quite chilly. Our itinerary covered 3 days, and we had 5 adult supervisors. They weren't constantly monitoring us. We simply needed to inform them which activities we planned to attend. The first day proved enjoyable. Alex and I, along with a couple of other classmates we knew, tried miniature golf, attempted an obstacle wall, swam in the indoor pool, and then had dinner. Following dinner, we returned to our accommodation and simply relaxed for a while. It's worth noting that not all the students were accommodated in adjacent rooms. Our ground floor room featured a clear sliding glass door offering a view of the small lake situated down the slope. We went out again briefly before heading back to the room around 9:30 p.m. We opted to leave the blinds open because the moonlight cast a cool reflection upon the water body below. We had no idea this decision would mark the beginning of a distressing experience. By my estimate, we spent a good 50 minutes just shifting in our beds, attempting to find comfort, occasionally conversing, before Alex, whose bunk was nearer the entrance, let out a sharp cry. I had no immediate understanding of what was happening, why he'd yelled, or if he was joking, until my gaze landed on the door. It was a scene lifted directly from a suspense film. There stood a woman, notably tall and slender, with long, pale gray hair, pressing her hands against the glass pane beside her face, as if trying to gain a clearer view inside the dwelling. After a moment, the woman simply moved away. Alex looked over at me, seemingly waiting for me to make the first move so he'd feel emboldened enough to get up and rush outside after her. When we did, however, there was no sign of her anywhere. The concrete path that ran along the front of every unit in the structure was empty. There was no one on the nearby grass, nor anyone descending the hill. Yet we had both clearly seen the woman, so we were certain we weren't hallucinating. The following day, we decided not to inform any of the chaperones, but we did share the experience with the 2 young women we were friends with. Night fell once more after a full day of varied pursuits. We entered the room via the rear door and made sure to secure the blinds tightly this time. Alex drifted off to sleep before I did. I followed suit about 40 minutes later. I awoke abruptly to stillness. I couldn't discern if something had roused me or not. All I knew was that something felt profoundly unsettling. I sat up and softly called Alex's name to see if he was awake. He didn't respond, so, purely out of instinct and curiosity, I turned to my left to check on him. But my sight line to his bunk was obstructed. I looked upward, and looming directly above my bed was the same tall, aged woman. She took 2 steps back before stating, "The secondary entrance was unsecured, then turned and exited through the rear door." I remained motionless in the bed, except for my uncontrollable trembling. I shook Alex awake and recounted what had transpired. We double-checked the back door lock, readjusted the blinds, and agreed to stay awake for the rest of the duration of the night. It was already 3:45 a.m., so we wouldn't be sacrificing a significant amount of sleep. By 8:15 a.m., we proceeded to the main lodge for breakfast. Upon returning to our housing unit, preparing to finally speak with our supervisors, we could see the old woman through the glass of the unit next door. She was seated on the bed, hands clasped, posture erect, facing the doorway, facing us. We immediately ran to the main lobby reception desk to report her to the facility personnel instead of the chaperones. It felt strange. None of them seemed particularly equipped to handle the situation. Eventually, we managed to persuade them to accompany us to the woman's room. Inside, they found the woman still seated in the identical posture, alongside an elderly gentleman sitting on the other bed looking up at them as they entered. Apparently, the woman suffered from some form of cognitive impairment, but the man also appeared somewhat disconnected. There was something deeply disquieting about both of them, and they simply didn't seem like the sort of individuals you'd expect to encounter at a family-oriented retreat. The staff wouldn't ask the couple to leave as we had hoped, so we then informed our chaperones. To make a long story short, after considerable debate between the chaperones and the staff, we had to curtail the trip earlier than planned, and we all headed back home. Alex and I were simply relieved to be departing that place. When I was in the 3rd grade, my class took a trip to a rural wildlife refuge about 70 minutes away from our school. I distinctly recall it being an overcast day with an occasional light drizzle. The refuge felt somewhat compact, but it was quite suitable for children. It featured a decent number of enclosures primarily for smaller indigenous fauna, nothing particularly exotic. There was also a substantial central pavilion as part of the refuge that housed preserved animal specimens on display, along with other curious exhibits I don't entirely remember. Admittedly, I was a bit peculiar during my elementary and middle school years. I'd engage in odd, solitary behaviors, and my instructors and my mother certainly took note. For reasons I still can't explain, while we were touring the pavilion as a group, I decided to enter one of the restrooms without informing any of the teachers. I finished my business, washed my hands, and stepped back out into the corridor. There was no one around. I started walking down a different passageway, one our group had not yet explored. I still vividly remember the subdued atmospheric lighting and the deep crimson carpets covering the floors of the corridors. My 9-year-old imagination was running wild as I observed all the fixed, lifeless creatures that had once been living, positioned behind glass panels. I halted my steps when I spotted a man quite obviously concealing himself behind a large stack of equipment cases. I believe I chuckled, assuming the man was playing a prank. He emerged from behind the cases and approached me, inquiring about the group's whereabouts. I responded that I didn't know. He grasped my hand and instructed me to accompany him. I must have believed he was guiding me back to the class. He led me to a service door, which opened onto the rear part of the structure near some large refuse bins, a few unused benches, and the adjacent woods. Once we were outside, his pulling became noticeably more forceful, and his grasp tightened around my wrist. He was attempting to drag me towards the trees. I didn't start screaming or crying for assistance, but I remember the sensation I felt deep in my stomach, a feeling of such intense fear that I thought I might vomit. And then, a female voice screamed at the top of its lungs. It was one of the instructors positioned on the opposite side of a low barrier. The man immediately released me and fled into the wooded area. Moments later, several teachers emerged through the service door onto this side of the barrier and quickly pulled me back inside. The teachers were initially upset with me, but simultaneously provided comfort and reassurance. They contacted my parents and the field trip was officially concluded. The facility management contacted the police department. We all reboarded the buses and everyone went home. As my bus was departing the parking area, however, my observant 9-year-old self noticed the man crouched down amidst the trees near the access road, partially hidden by a thick branch, observing the vehicles pass by. Once again, for some inexplicable reason, I remained silent. I was likely too timid at the time or simply too shaken up to vocalize anything. All the other children looked at me oddly for the remainder of the ride home. I didn't particularly care, but I sincerely hope that man never succeeded in abducting an unsuspecting young child like myself on that occasion. Back in my later high school years, I enrolled in a class focused on unexplained phenomena and folklore, or something along those lines. I can't recall the exact course name. It essentially covered real-world puzzles and unsettling stories. I was quite interested in that sort of subject matter. I was taking the class alongside a good friend whom I'll refer to as Chris for this narrative. The course instructor arranged an excursion to a nearby abandoned settlement with an obscure history. The community was reportedly established in the early 1900s, but appeared to have been hastily deserted shortly after its construction. The journey there by bus took approximately 25 minutes. All of us students were captivated, gazing out the bus windows as we traversed a rather rough, overgrown path cutting through dense woodland. The path eventually opened into a clearing. We had arrived. We stepped out onto the old road, which had tall grass pushing through its cracks. The surrounding vegetation was nearly waist-high. Then there were the structures, imposing antique stone buildings with blocked-up window openings, all emanating a distinctly chilling atmosphere. The teacher gathered all 30 of us, verified the head count, and then began leading the way. The objective of this short excursion was to utilize the observational skills we had supposedly developed in class to see if we could piece together any theories about why the settlement might have been abandoned so long ago. Some of the buildings had gaps in the walls serving as impromptu entrances. There were even excavations near some of the structures, seemingly dug to access the sublevels of certain buildings which felt inherently eerie. However, one particular structure stood taller than all the others. It simply captured my attention the most. While the teacher was guiding the main group towards what seemed to be the central assembly hall, Chris and I decided to discreetly slip away on our own to search for anything noteworthy. As we headed in the direction of the most imposing building, we spotted an opening in the earth. It had been dug adjacent to the building's rear entrance, which itself had been sealed shut. Within the opening was a makeshift staircase leading down to the stone floor below. We exchanged glances, and in that moment, we both understood we had to investigate. Chris descended first, followed by me. Fortunately, this was right around the time when mobile devices started incorporating flashlight functions. So we had a source of illumination. The atmosphere down there was undeniably unsettling. There were a couple of discarded beverage cans, some minor graffiti on one wall, and piles of decaying lumber everywhere. A wooden stairwell ascended into complete darkness as all windows and access points from above had been sealed. We had already ventured this far as to enter the building, so we reasoned we should also ascend the stairs. I went first, and with each step, the groaning protest of the century-old timber made me feel as if I might collapse through every single tread. Chris followed suit. This upper level of the building felt very cramped. It seemed to consist of numerous openings leading off into different smaller compartments. It was so profoundly dark inside that you would never even realize it was broad daylight outside. Chris and I were genuinely starting to feel unnerved being in there and mutually agreed it was time to head back outside. But just at that instant there was a distinct sound originating from one of the small rooms, like something heavy scraping or thudding on the concrete floor. A normal reaction would have been to flee, but Chris and I froze, locked eyes for a brief second, then both cautiously crept over to the opening of the room. We directed our lights into the space and then we ran. We scrambled back down the stairs and then clambered up the corroded ladder back outside. We caught up with the group, breathless. We didn't say anything, though, to avoid getting into trouble. One of our fellow students inquired what was wrong. We told him we had ventured into one of the structures, and that in one of the rooms, when we shone our lights inside, we saw 3 figures standing, perhaps 3 meters away from the doorway, facing Chris and me in a strange alignment, almost as if they were anticipating our presence. As we continued following the group, we paid extra attention to the tall building we had entered from a distance, and before we departed the site, we distinctly saw a person's countenance at one of the upper-level window openings that had not been boarded shut. We never informed the instructor, fearing disciplinary action. We were left utterly unsure of what to conclude. Were they simply transient individuals seeking shelter there? Were they involved in illicit activities and hiding? Chris unsettles me with his proposition. He suggests they were apparitions of the former residents of the settlement. Nevertheless, the manner in which those 3 figures were just silently standing there, staring calmly at us the very moment we peered through that doorway. I still cannot erase that image from my mind. Perhaps I will revisit that settlement one day, if only to definitively disprove Chris's idea.